Do you want me to say that all over again? Right, well, you're welcome to St. Colmcille's Church, Swords. Most of you, I think, probably have been here before. I don't know if there's anybody new who hasn't been. But we did this last year for the first time, and unfortunately, it's the last day of National Heritage Week, and it seems to always clash with Dublin playing in Croke Park. But as Father Carey said last night, if you're not interested in football, go for the walk around the graveyard. So last year, we talked about kind of people that were buried here that were characters. So we'll go through a few of those again, and I'm going to go a different way and maybe talk about some of these heroes of 1916 and various things like that who are in the graveyard. Is that all right? So I think just to say, the church was built in 1827 at the behest of Father Carey as well, whose plaque is inside on the wall. And he was a Dominican priest who was sent here. The Archbishop of Dublin at the time was an Archbishop Troy, who was also a Dominican, and he got permission for this Father Carey to come to this parish. And he was here till he died in 1850, and he was responsible for building this church, because the original church was down where at the back of the Star, the older one. But the headstone here is that big one to Father Mulcahy, and I had it advertised as heroes and characters. Now, to me, I would call a character. I've never met him, but I used to hear my granny talking about him, and I think he ruled the parish in the proverbial rod of iron. He was responsible for building the parochial house and lots of things like that. But the other thing we found out, and Mary, you know this, when we were doing oral history years ago, one of the girls on the project interviewed her old aunt, and he said that when the courting couples were up the chapel lane, he used to chase them with a stick and read out their names off the altar the following Sunday. So that's Father Mulcahy. He was a Waterford man, and he died in 1912, and he did do a lot of good as well, for the schools and that. So he's what I would call a character. So the one beside it is a family called Donnelly. I'm not too sure. And the other one then is Father O'Reilly, who only died in 2006. Some of you probably remember him. His only claim to fame, I would say, was that he was first cousin of Archdeacon Horan, who started the airport at Knock. They were Mayo, he was from Mayo, so he's there. And Father Sean O'Neill died, but he chose to be buried wherever he came from, down in the Midlands, so he's not here. The other characters that are over this way are, now we'll just go over here a bit. You'll see a lot of old swords names like Dardas and Lowndes, and Lowndes is, I would say, the oldest name in swords. They claim to have been descended from Archbishop Henry de Lons, who was an archbishop in Swords Castle. So that's their story, and I think it probably makes sense, Over here is, now we'll go over this way. This one is the grave of Dr. Robert J. May. Some of you might have heard of him if you're old swords. Dr. May was the doctor in swords he was there in 1916, I know, up to the 1970s, when there was only the one doctor. He was the district medical officer, but he was a little man. He originally came from Drogheda, and people used to call him Tricks, and he was responsible for a lot of nicknames that were around the town. When they built the houses down in Seatown Villas, he christened them Doc Amora. You know that? Yeah. And then there was other things like that he used to say, but the one thing he was associated with in swords was reviving the mumming tradition in swords. And we used to, when I was a child in the 1950s, he used to have all these mumming competitions down in the Slough Hall, which is down beside the Fingallions football field. And he also was an expert on Irish wolfhounds. He was renowned as a breeder of Irish wolfhounds. But I would call him a character as well. He was, and he was very funny. I remember him when I was a child coming up to me. I was about 4, and my mother's sister was a nurse, and I had all these red spots on me, and she thought I'd scarlet fever. And he came up and he told her that I was allergic to duck eggs, so my mother had to get rid of the ducks that we had. So that was that. So I don't know whether I was or not, but anyway. Now, the next one here I would call a character as well. The next one was Father Lawrence Kelly. He was here when I was going to school too in the 1960s. Some of you might remember him. And he was related to Eamon Kelly, the Shanachie. I think he was his uncle. He was a big, hairy man, very learned and not sort of parish priest material. He was more interested in the arts and poetry and all sorts of stuff like that. But he was very funny. He used to come into the school, in the national school below. I remember one time him bringing in a windy up gramophone and telling the teacher we were all his father's Sidney McKeown, and we were all to bring flowers of the fairest and sing it on the 1st of May. And when I'll tell you the way we sang it, and we murdered it, and we sang it like this: bring flowers of the fair, and and nobody told us that wasn't the way you should sing it. I remember it because there used to be a 10 o'clock mass every Sunday for the children, and we used to get slapped if we didn't go on Monday. Say, where were you yesterday? Canon Kelly, I have one. I was reared up in Mountgorry on the Malahide Road, and myself and my pal, another Bernie Troy, we used to walk up the chapel lane in the dark. We never minded, we never were afraid. But one night we were going up and we heard all this noise coming along, and it was him. In those times there was a big wall all along there before those houses were built, and the parish priest had a right of way from the pastoral, what's now the pastoral office, and you'd see him emerging out this green gate in the wall to come into the church, and he used to walk up the lane, but he had some complaint, I think, that he didn't sleep very well, and he used to be out walking around the lanes and that. But a funny story I was told about that. He was going for a walk over the Drynham Road one time, and I think it was a holiday weekend, Whit or August weekend, and he met these chaps coming down the road. They were going to get the bus at the corner to go home for the weekend, and he got talking to them, and he used to slig along like that and make noise when he was walking, and he kind of pondered when he'd be speaking. He was very like Eamon Kelly. Eamon Kelly was looked very like him. But he asked these lads where they came from. So it seems they were from Kerry. And he said, what part of Kerry are you from? And I don't know now. Let's say Carsavine. I don't know. And he was talking to them, and he said to them, oh, did you ever know any Kellys down there? And the fellow said, oh yeah, there was a big family of them. One of them was a doctor and one of them was something else, and there was another fella priest, and they called him Mad Larry. So your man said nothing, and they jogged along, and when they got to what we used to call the Barrack Corner, the bus was coming up to town, and he said, goodbye now lads, and when you get to Carsavine, tell them you met Lad Larry. So I'd say their faces were red. So that's Canon Kelly, and a lot of people, if you went to confession to him now, some of you probably know that, you'd be in there for an hour, but he was likeable, and I would call him a character as well.
I went to confess. Sorry.
Yeah.
I was at school.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, and I think it was a Saturday. Do you remember the 10 rows for confessions on a Saturday night? And you went every week.
Yes, yeah.
So I had been at something in school, and I came in my school uniform and into the confession box.
Yeah.
So he asked me, did I ever see the Northern Lights? This was in the middle of winter.
Oh, that'd be him. Yeah.
So out he marches me out of the confession box in front of the 10 rows, out here into the graveyard. Was I petrified? And of course I didn't know what, and I kept saying, oh yeah, it's lovely, and I didn't no idea. And then back into the confession box again. But people probably wonder, what did she do?
I know, So that's it.
Like, he was pure.
Yeah, he was. He really, a character, for want of a better word, So I don't know if there are any more around here now. Whose one is that one? Thomas J. Lowndes. Well, no, he was just Tommy Lowndes that lived up the town. I don't think. Actually, the Lowndeses are a family that go back. They're related. They're like the Savages. They're related to a lot of other families around the place. They're actually, my grandmother's first husband was a Lowndes, and he died, and then she married my grandfather, who was from Wicklow. So, there are always these connections with different people around. I suppose people didn't move around much, So I think for a change, maybe we'll go into what we used to call the new part, and up along. And Mary, you might remember where you found some of these. Oh, are there? Oh, will Will we go that way then? Yeah. No, it's okay. Sorry. Rathfield Hall. and they were a family that were there for generations. And when I was a child, this one here, and that one, I think. But the one thing I remember, Lady Mary Corblich, I don't know, did you remember? I remember her coming into Mass with her hearing aid and holding it up like this. And when we were, and they used to come in a pony and trap and tie it out on the hooks on the wall. But sometime after, when we started doing oral history, we went out to Booterstown to interview her daughter, who was a Mrs. Barrett, and she was quite elderly at the time. And she told us all about the family, and she said they used to. I said, "What did you do for recreation?" "Oh, we used to visit the Talbots of Malahide Castle and the Maxwells of Carduff and all this, you see." And sometime after that, I met one of these Miss Maxwells in the bank, and I was saying, "Oh, I said I was out with Mrs. Barrett, Lady Mary Corbley's daughter." "Oh, yes," she says, "I used to hate going over there because it was always full of midgets." So, like, people like you were either very rich or very poor, I think, you know. So, okay, I want to get the inscription of that one. So that was that. Now, the ones, I don't know where Mary, she was helping me with this now. I don't know what she found. We'll go up. Yeah, I know it's that some of the tailors are buried up here. And now, what did you find for us, Mary? Cleparton there. When I was a child, it was a field. There was nothing in it at all. It had been donated. The site for the church and this was donated by a James Taylor of Swords House. But I remember that being empty. No, I notice now at the Blessing of the Graves, the crowds are always in there. There's never very many around here because I think the old families have died out, you know. Where's she gone to? Coleman's of Swords, and the family of Richard O'Coleman, or Richard Coleman, who was leader in 1916 here in Swords. Anyway, probably it's well documented, and you'll probably get turned off listening to all these stories now. But in 1916, they all met at Knocksadan on Easter Monday, and the idea was they were going to the Battle of Ashbourne, but they got word from Commandant Connolly that he wanted 40 men to come in from here to give a hand in town, and they could only spare 20. So 20, Thomas Ashe picked out 20 to go into town, and this Richard O'Coleman was the leader. So they all had to walk, and my father was one of them, and I was reared up listening to the stories. And they got to the GPO, and then some of them were sent down to the Mendicity Institute, where it was quite a fierce battle, and one of them, a man called Peter Wilson, was killed, and there's a plaque to him down on Bridge Street opposite the Pound Pub. And this is the Coleman grave, and it mentions him on that, but he's actually buried in Glasnevin in the Republican plot. Some people used to think he's buried there, but the Colemans were a family. They lived on Main Street, along there where the AIB is now, and the father was a teacher in the boys' school here, and the mother ran a shop. Her maiden name was Murray, and they had a generation back then. They'd some connection with Colonel Foster and Swords House. I think one of them worked there, and somewhere along the line they're supposed to be related to my granny, and this usual thing. But that's who they are. And now there is another old family grave of the O'Colemans down beside the church, and I used to have a lot to do with a man called Richard O'Coleman, but he died a couple of years ago. He was 90. He would be the nephew of Dick Coleman, as they called him, and it's a pity, like he would have been delighted with all this stuff going on now, but I got a lot of information from him. And Dick Coleman died in 1918, when, like, after they were in prison, and then they came home, and he was active in politics again, and he was arrested, and he died of pneumonia in Usk prison, which is in North Wales, in December 1918. So he's buried beside Thomas Ashe in Glasnevin. Now, I don't know where headstone is broken, and it's a long family story, so I won't go into details now. What am I doing? I think we'll make our way up onto there. If I'm sorry for bringing you on the grass, but the path is blocked up. And about this big tree, it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And when I was a child, myself and my pal were able to do that. And now you wouldn't be able to do it now, you know. It's a palm tree of some. Is it a yew? Yeah. And somebody thinks like that somebody planted at the end of the grave, but I remember that headstone that's stuck in it now being miles away from it actually when I was a child, you know. So anyway, I think we'll go up to the kettle one. Maybe if some of you weren't here before, you might know about it. I don't know which is the best way to get out. This way. I'm going to do the kettle one, Mary, because it's of interest. You could, if you want to take a photograph, you could take one of them at this when you're ready. Now, we all around. This, some of you who weren't here last year, this is one. This is a monument to a man called Andrew Kettle, who died. Andrew Kettle was born in Drynham. They were farmers in 1833, and he's the father of Tom Kettle, who killed in World War I. Now, Andrew Kettle was, like in his memoirs, he talks about the night of the big wind, and he looked up and he couldn't understand why he could see the stars because the roof had blown off their house, and it was different things like that. But he got involved in sort of land wars, and he was known as Parnell's right-hand man, and somebody told me that when that monument was put up to him, they had all the traffic on Swords Main Street was held up getting it down and all like that. Now his son was Tom Kettle, whom you probably know all about. He was an MP and a raconteur poet and all like that, and for some reason he joined the British Army and he was killed on the Somme, and he was so sad that Tom had been killed. He died a few weeks after in 1916, so that would be quite it's quite a remarkable thing, and maybe a lot of people don't know it's here, you know. He is, yeah.
I was asking, I brought you the article.
Oh yes, yeah. It is, because we looked it up.
Buried here 20 years.
I don't, yeah. But there's so many Kettle. Yeah, I'll have a look. There's so many Kettle graves. You see, they have along when we start doing our oral history first. I interviewed Mrs. McLaughlin of Roganstown, and she was a Kettle, and she told me that from the Drynham farm, 3 other brothers got given their share of it, and then you had Kettles of Warblestown and Kettles of here and Kettles, and they're all. Mary knows about them as well, but he is buried there because we looked up the newspapers and it said to adjoining cemetery, so you know. And that Mrs. McLaughlin, she was 90 when I interviewed her about 20 years ago, and she said she remembered being at the funeral. She was about 10, that he was cousin of her father's, you know, so it's fairly, I didn't make it up, like, you know. So that's that one. Now, where's me secretary gone to? Do you want to wait there? Hold.
Here, you go to win, I'll hold it for you.
You should be right in there. Good position, Bernadette.
I'll try to play.
Oh, no, they've covered up somewhere.
I'm tall enough. Stand up straight.
Okay, that's grand. Thanks, Mary. Now, where are we going next? I think if we go back out into what we call the new park, there's a few in there that are worth mentioning, you know. Thomasina Linders, and Mary Julia Weston. Now, anyone that grew up in Swords might have brought their sweets in Julia Weston's shop on the corner of the Seatown Lane. But and Thomasina was a Weston as well. They were sisters, and they were both very active in the 1916 Rising in Cummin and these records are all online now, but they seem to have been great kind of people that time, going on dispatches and all sorts of things, particularly Thomasina. But I remember them as two old ladies, and I got a nice photograph of them, and we have it in the next Swords Voices, which has been launched on Wednesday. But we always call her Julia Weston, and I used to laugh as a child when people would call her Mary Julia Weston, and she was Miss Weston and that. But there weren't, and people seem to forget that women played a very active part that time, you know. So that's who they are. Now I don't know who else we found along here, Mary. Did we? There's yeah, because I remember I loved him.
Oh yeah, but he was a
lovely man, yeah. I put a bit in the Swords Voices now. I found a lot of information on a website called anam.ie. It was all a scale, so I put it in because Maureen there drew my attention to it.
Nice.
Yeah,
Right.
yes.
Yeah, we did a bit of cleaning up on it there.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
I want to do
Yeah.
rewriting.
Yes,
The
yeah. Because
1916 coming up.
yeah, I remember because he taught us, you see, in school.
He did, of
you know,
course.
and he'd always be telling us all lots of other things when we'd be doing the art.
Yes,
you know,
yeah.
I found him a lovely man.
Yeah.
Yeah. No.
He's down near the
Yeah.
bridge further down.
Yeah. Oh right. No, will we see?
Row 29.
Okay.
Row 29.
There are row
The
numbers
numbers
in
will
here?
be in there.
Yeah. There's so many of them here. It's very hard to know who to pick out to talk about. You know, so.
He's tucked in there under the hedges.
Over here.
That is very low down.
Don't know if they'll all go over there, will they?
It'll be up the next.
The next one, is it?
Just the one in here, I think, Bernadette.
Celtic cross.
The greyish kind of one, is it? That beside the big black one?
Yes.
Okay, well we'll go in there then. This is of interest. I put it in the book, so I suppose somebody said, he's not from Swords. I don't care.
He's from Belfast.
I know, I got it all. I knew that. Oh, I knew that, and I knew about his background. Yeah, I've heard.
But he
Yeah.
worked hard for Swords.
Oh, he did. He did.
As you say, he taught you and he taught the ladies.
Yeah, and I have another piece for the Voices that a lady sent to us from America. She's 80 now, and she went to the school there, and she had, and I didn't cop on at the time. I hadn't read what she had sent, and she said that she had her first crush on a man on Halva Winnicon, or Mr. Monaghan, as we used to call him. Yeah, would you believe it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So now,
Yes.
now.
Needs a little work done on it, but it's okay.
But still, it's there. Well, I wouldn't have known. Only Maureen told me. Now she
After
really.
they put his wife in there, they never did anything.
But she buried there as well.
She's
Oh,
buried
is
there
she?
as well.
Yeah.
They
No.
didn't do that. It was all relations.
All right. Okay.
I have to get that sorted.
This is it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been tidied up since.
Oh, like so Helmy says. Yeah. Yeah. That's Helmy. That's Helmy. That's Maureen O'Brien.
I'm allowed.
Yeah. No, I have to walk on this grave.
Yeah, look a gift. Yeah.
Now, this is something unusual, which was maybe unusual, maybe that's not the word, but it's something that Maureen O'Brien there drew my attention to this man called Alva Winnicon. Now, there probably isn't anybody here that went to the vocational school in Swords in the 1950s, but I did. And Alva Winnicon, or Mr. Monaghan as we call him, was the art teacher, a lovely man who was very Republican minded, and he used to calling Joss Gaeilge all the time. I remember he gave me the first Fáinne I ever had. But his background is that he came from Belfast, and he briefly he was active in the 1916 Rising with Liam Mellows in Galway, and that's online. But he is buried here in Swords. He died in 1967, so I just thought that it would be a different story. And I've written a little bit about him in the next Swords Voices, which is coming out. And I actually found one of his sketches of a leprechaun, and I've reproduced it. He was a wonderful artist. Like, we used to be fascinated. Do anybody remember the Brian O'Higgins Christmas cards? He used to get here. Well, he designed most of them, and he could draw these Celtic freehand on the blackboard, and he drew all these funny little leprechauns. And the one I found was in the Wolf Tone Annual. He was involved in that of 1950, so I took it out, so I have it in it just to pay, because we all loved him going to school. He was a lovely man, a lovely teacher. So that's just somebody different now. That you know, we always call these projects graveyards, the hidden history. So that's a little bit that's been uncovered now this year. Okay. So you can read a bit more about him when you buy the Swords Voices, which will be a lot. Yeah.
You know where you can look into what they've written.
Oh, I did that. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
It's a fantastic read.
Yeah.
He was on the run from
Yeah.
Galway.
That's right. It is all online. Yeah.
A man called
Yeah.
Frank Hines.
Yes. Yeah.
Who actually, Frank Hines.
To relate to you, is he?
No, he's
Yeah.
his son
Yeah.
officiated at my mother's wedding.
Ah, right.
I
Yeah.
think he may have had
Yeah.
it, but
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they ended up in court.
Yeah, and the record office says that his brother was killed going to Killorglin to meet Roger Casement as well. So they were very, very, and they were, but the father was from Wexford. There's quite a lot in it's a website I came across called anam.com or anam. It's something to do with art, but it's Os Gaeilge. But I was able to make most of it out actually, even though my Os Gaeilge is kind of a bit weak because I don't practice it. But I could read it, and I put in a kind of a synopsis of his life in the Swords Voices, but I thought it was something different that people might like to know about. Okay? Right. So now I'm sorry, do you want to say who you are? Do you want me to say? Yes, exactly. Do you want me to say who you are? Do you mind? Do you mind? Yes, Helmi is here. She's yes. Helmi was German, and she was fostered by the Monaghan's after the war. And I remember you, little one, coming down to the Fla that we used to have. Do you remember that? And she's come out today, and we're done. Maureen remembers that. Yeah. No.
You're my idol.
Yeah. Yeah.
You could do it, yeah. I really want to be married.
Yeah. She was a lovely little one. Yeah, I remember them bringing you down. We used to have this fla in the school every year, and we had to do everything and sing and cook the food and all. And Mr. Monaghan, as we call him, and this child and Peggy, wasn't that the wife's name? They were the guests of Onyx. Miss Duggan taught the world of them, you know. So that was that. So there, I was delighted to see you again now, you know. So that's something different. No. Yeah. So I'm sorry you have to go back all the way down the way you came now. Is that all right?
Would that have been when you were in national school?
No, it's in the tech.
So Mammy would have been there.
Yeah, she would have, yeah. She probably would have, yeah.
I just wondered if she knew him because she was so.
Well, she was a year after me, so she probably would have, yeah. You all right, Bernie? Yeah, more details about this. But there's another one up there of a man called Arthur Agnew, who's not born. There's another man who came over from Liverpool to be involved in the 1916 Rising. And he's actually, well, his family, if anybody knows the Marquis up on the Rappiel Road, Kathleen Marquis is his daughter. And the Agnews are very well known, you know, the singer and Art. But we interviewed Art Jr. He's about 90 now. And he was very, very deeply involved in the Rising. He came came over from Liverpool, and he was in this Kimmage garrison, which was stationed in Kimmage, obviously on land belonged to Count Plunkett. But he settled down in Swords because he had met some of the Kellys in the Rising, which, Cochney Kelly, Kitty's father. So they settled in Swords in the 1940s. So his headstone is Mary. Mary's helped me, but we should have kind of got. We're still working on this for next year, But he's another one that's buried here that wouldn't be what they call Old Swords, He was the sacristan, and
We were running.
Yes, yeah, I know. There's more runner-ins now. We only see locals at funerals now. So that was Mr. Agnew, and I got a lovely photograph in North Street of Tim Clark's shop and the Agnew's post office beside it. So it's one that I hadn't seen before, so we have that in the book as well. But I'd say there's loads of stuff lying around out there. It's just to get people to part with it, So anyway, so the other, there's lots of people that going back in history, like there's John Hamill there. Now his grandfather was the headmaster in the local school for years as well, and you see him in all these old school photographs that we had, So, and I think they came from Monaghan or somewhere, didn't they, John, or something? Oh, was it? Was it your granny that came from Monaghan? Because my mother knew her. Yeah. But these people all had a what would you say? They helped the town to grow, and because somebody said to me, you'll have to branch out and start interviewing people who are not Old Swords. So like I ended up doing kind of Jerry Larkin and Jane Redmond and some of them, but they've all paid. You know what I'm trying to say, that they've all contributed to the growth of the town. In other words,
We have a lovely photograph of my father in the school football team and Mr. Hamill.
Mr. Hamill, yeah.
And he had the +4s and all.
Oh, yeah. I know, yeah. So now,
My father was very young.
yeah, will we go on another bit and see what else we can find to talk about? It's quite warm today, actually, isn't it? Thanks to God.
Much better.
Yeah, a priest in Castleblaney, but they were all reared down in Balheary, and I was coming up here one day, and these people had come up from Castleblaney to look for his grave. I don't know what there's something they treat him like a kind of a saint down there, and I don't know what the story is, but these people were looking for the grave, and luckily enough I knew where it was. They just happened to meet me. But he's now there's a grave there, Bartle Weston, Rathfield Road. He would have been in the 1916 Rising as well. He's one of the Westons, and I don't know who these. Do you remember them?
He's our next door.
Yeah. Well, he was in the Battle of Ashbourne. Yeah. That one there, the white one, Bernie.
Right.
Yeah. You okay? Yeah, there were two Bartle Westons, I think. Paddy Weston's father there were two, but they were related. Yeah. And then there was Tom as well. You remember on the green too? Yeah. So now,
He's Paddy Weston. Paddy Weston was his father.
so we go.
So he'd be a grandson of not that Bartle Weston, but a different Bartle Weston.
No. So we go on another bit. Now, we see one over there is to James Joseph Hearn, Malahide Road, and he's the father of, I'm sure you remember the Hearns on the Malahide Road. There were 10 of them, but Liam was the oldest of them, and Liam is supposed to be, I thought, to be here today to tell all about his father, but Liam's passion is horse racing, so I'd say if there's a race on somewhere he won't get him. But James Joseph Hearn, the family originally came from Carlow, and I think they lived somewhere on the north side, like the North Strand or Fairview, but this particular fellow was about 16 at the time, and he was in O'Connell Street and in the GPO. And Liam maintains, if any of you have ever seen that film, Mish Era, the beginning of it shows a little fella running across the street with a message, and he thinks that might have been his father. But he was whatever he got involved in, he was arrested, and he was in Frongok with the rest of the lads, you know. But he was only about 16 at the time. But he's one that's not old swords. But then, of course, his wife was Stacia Howard, who would have been a cousin of all the Lawlesses, you see, that are involved in it. So the connection on both sides. But there was a man going around called Maurice O'Keefe. He's doing a project for the government. He's interviewing all the relatives of people who are in the Rising. So he was out here, and he interviewed Liam, and he interviewed me. And I told him all about it. I was only 6 months old when my father died, but he obviously told my mother a lot about it. And with this stuff on it, she was quite accurate now in what she said. But one thing I did say, and this I think must be when she was going out with him, she asked him, you know, was he delighted when the sentence to death was commuted to penal servitude? And he said no, that he had his mind made up to die for Ireland. You see, and I told this, but I was in bed one morning, and I also put this man in touch with Art Agnew. Now, Art is 90, and he was telling about his father. But I heard this man's voice. He's a Kerry man. Gosh, they must be interviewing Maurice about the project. The next thing I heard Art Agnew saying something. And then the next thing I heard this voice, and I said, God, that's me. And it was just that little snippet about that one little bit. And they were all saying, oh, I heard you on the wireless, and didn't even know it was on, you know. But yeah, well, like I have a letter that he wrote to my granny, and like he sounded like he's in Lewis prison, and he's talking about we're lying out in the sun. He was only 21, and like they didn't care, I don't think, you know, like this was it. But they had their mind made up to die for Ireland. This is what they said. So there you are. Now we go on down and see who else can we find, if that's all right with you. Are everybody happy? Okay. Time he lived up on the Dublin Road. Some of you might remember him, I'm not sure. Yeah. You know. That itself.
It's hard to hear you at the back.
Oh, is it? I know, but
make half of them go ahead of you.
I know. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I know it's a very low note.
Savage and Michael and that was, they probably know all about them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of savages around, buried.
Yeah, well, in a few generations back there was a family of 17 of savages, and that's how there's so many of them.
Yeah.
They're all married to everyone in swords, kind of. You know,
yes.
there's loads of them. Just to give you a little, somebody has asked me about the Taylors of Swords House and the Taylors that are in the Star. I wouldn't kind of dispute that they're related, because with the family tree of the Taylors of Swords House goes back to 1200 and something, when a Walter Taylor built a mansion house in Swords. But they only seem to keep a record of the eldest son who inherited the estate. But they all seem to have 10 children, so I wouldn't dispute that these Taylors are descended some way out. But the interesting thing to do with here is the site for this church was given by James Taylor of Swords House, and it was built in 1827, 2 years before the Catholic Emancipation, which I think might be why it's up the lane and not down there where the original church was. James Taylor never married, so his sister was Elizabeth Ann Taylor, who married a man called Josiah Foster from the West Indies, and they lived there then, and they seemed to take over the estate. And that Lady Mary Corbley's daughter that I mentioned before, we were talking about this when I went into her, and she said that he was a bit peculiar, this James Taylor, and that's why the other woman inherited through the female line. But the interesting thing about it as well, and it was something I was involved in about 20 years ago. Francis Taylor was the son of one of the Taylors there in the 16th century, and he was the second son, and he didn't inherit the estate. He went into Dublin and became very prosperous as a merchant up around the south side, St. Audwin Church and that, and he was the mayor of Dublin. And then because he wouldn't sign the oath, you know, at the Reformation and that, he was put into jail and he died. So he's Francis Taylor, that blessed Francis Taylor, that the picture is in there. But he was definitely of that family that was there. And when all this was going on, I got this letter from Archbishop Connell. There was the time to go to this meeting in the Archbishop's house. So I ended up being on a committee because of the Swords connection. And we ran a seminar down in the Moss at the time, and they were happy with it. So that's another little bit of something maybe some of you wouldn't know about, but that's why his photograph is in there. Okay, now there are Taylors. Some of the Taylors are buried in a headstone over there with people called Bailey, and they're supposed to be related, and I'm not sure. I can't find it, to be honest. I don't know what the relationship is. And you know, when Father Sean O'Neill got the refurbishment done here, they found a piece of paper in a bottle under the altar, and it was the list of the men that had worked on it in about 1881 or 2, and it's signed by a James St. Lawrence. I used to hear my mother saying that St. Lawrence's owned the Star, so obviously St. Lawrence's were related to Taylors, and they, you know, they're all related. And like the history of the big tree down there were people called Phillips owned it, but the mother was a Taylor, and then Taylors ended up taking it over. So that's probably how Taylors came to own these pubs in the town. But you could go on and on about all these different things. Now, if you want to come up, and the old Coleman grave is up along there, and there's also another man up there who I think was in the 1916 Rising as well. Okay, as you did. And we stood along the Liffey Wall to get the bus home. And I remember seeing these vans going around the city with Tel El Kibar written on the side of them. And I remember saying to my mother, "Mommy, what's that mean?" And she didn't know, you see. And I wondered, and then I forgot all about it. And some years ago, I was researching the history of this Colonel Foster and his military record, and I discovered that he had fought at a battle of Tel El Kibar, which was a Turkish war, something to do with the Suez Canal around that time. And she said, no, that rings a bell. So then I sussed it out a bit further, and the story was that the Major Hooley or somebody who was in charge of that was from Inchicore, and he came back to Dublin, and there was also some soldier called Sutton who was in the same battle, and they lived out around Monkstown. And when he came home, he started a dairy business in Monkstown, and he called it Tel El Kibar. And Tel El Kibar used to be on the milk bottles, and then it turned into TEK. And if some of you are from the south side, you could set these milk bottles with TEK. And I think the only thing left there now, somebody said to me in Dunleary Historical Society or something, that it's just a football field or a football team called TEK Rovers or something like that. But you know, it's amazing the kind of things you can find out. You know, but I wonder what does that mean, you know, and like years and years after I found out, you know. So that's the Taylors of Swords House. Now the Colonel Foster died in 1915, and he's buried in what my mother used to call the Strangers Bank, which is up there. He didn't want any fuss, or there's no headstone over to him or anything like that. But they were very good to the people of Swords, and they were one of these families that remained Catholic. You know, they lost their lands and got it back. Like I had the family tree. Some of them were planted down in Mayo, and then they came back again. And there's, you know, a lot of quite interesting stuff to do with them. Okay, so anybody want to know anything else? No?
About the list of people that were in that church.
Yeah.
Any of them buried here, or were
We don't know. One of them, I forget what was on that now. There was a Davis, very hard to read, and the paper was all kind of falling apart. There was a Davis on it, which I think probably might have been, and I think a McGuinness or something. I can't remember. There were 3 or 4, but I would imagine if there were people who were doing marble work, they mightn't have been from around about here at all. But it was signed by Father Mulcahy and this James St. Lawrence, and that, I say that's probably why he was in a porter bottle if he owned the Star. Yeah.
The south end of Chapel Lane on the far side of the Malahide Road is now called Foster Lane.
Foster Way, yes. Yeah. Well, I named that. We used to have a place. I used to be involved in a naming committee in the council, but it kind of went a bit kaput when they stopped building. But the idea, like we in the Historical Society around, we'd been agitating for years to get the builders to use local names rather than we used to call it the Tuscany Down syndrome, like, you know. So there was the criteria then on the planning now that they had to go to a historical society. So they came to me that time, and I said, well, like they would have owned all that land, and we didn't want to call it Taylor Way, you know, so it's Foster Way. So that's how it got its name. Yeah.
But you know the lane.
Yeah.
The part of the lane, I'm not sure I can remember now. The part of the lane that's from the Malahide Road over to Drynham Road. That's Clifford's Lane. Oh, is it Clifford's Lane?
No, that's the other side. Yeah. No, they were my ancestors actually. Yeah. No, the Chapel Lane, right up around the Chapel Lane and all up around Ashley where I live now, that was all the domain belonged to Swords. So all around here was Swords domain, and like that was the wood when we were children. And then that's what I was going to tell you. After Colonel Foster died, the house was bought by Nicholas Long, who owned Milton House, which is now the Pavilions. And then after that, I think maybe in the 1930s or 40s, people called Feenans bought it, and they lived there up to the time that the council took it over, and they were a bit odd, for want of a better word, and because we used to be always afraid of this Peggy Feenan chasing us out of the wood when we were kids, you know. So that's the story of Swords House. But it was a pity. I remember when Swords Historical Society started first in 1982, that house was still there, and somebody said, oh, we'd take it over, make it into a community centre. And I was delighted at the prospect of this happening. And then we heard that somebody set it on fire, and then of course they knocked it down and turned it into a park, but that didn't work very well either, I don't think. So the county hall is there whether you like it or not, so that's it, you know. So there you are. Okay. Now,
Colonel Foster had his own door into the church. He had his own door. Yes, he had his own door into the church, and there is a mark there in the wall where there was a door. It's closed up, and he had a certain amount of seats up in the front that were for his staff. And there's a lot of in that book I did on the church, I researched it because I went into the archives in the Archbishop's house, and there's a lot of stuff on it where this James Taylor was having a row with the priest that was here, Father Carey, it must have been, or was it? I've forgotten now. But he said it was something to do with building the church, and he planned to give them the site, and 2 years later it hadn't been sorted out. I think this was the story, but the letters that went into Archbishop Murray, they're called the Murray Papers, your man Taylor is saying that if he didn't care or something, that I don't know what it was. Father Carey said that, I think it was Father Carey, that if he didn't do it, that he wouldn't bring the communion down to the seat to Mrs. Taylor. She could come up to the altar with everyone else. There's a lot of stuff like that. That's very funny, but they sorted it out in the end, you know. So it takes a lot. I remember when I was sleuthing and doing that book I did, like I ended up trying to research all the plaques that were on the stations, but it got much bigger than I thought it would, and I ended up with all sorts of stories, you know. And Father Sean was alive. He kept saying, "Oh no, put them all in," you know. But there's probably a lot more we could find out, you know. So do you want to go around to the old Coleman grave is around there, and there's another one there that
Bernie. I was just just over the wall. There's a grave of Matty Fern. He was known as the Buzzer Fern.
Oh, I know.
He was one of
I have all the stuff on him. Actually, I was the first that wrote something about him, and then the Fingal Independent picked it up. Yeah, I know. Yeah, because we had a photograph of some of them, Liam Shackleton and Leo Birmingham. We had it in Taylor's window. Somebody gave to. Yeah, I knew about him. All right.
It was just by pure coincidence I saw
but he wouldn't be buried here. And was he not buried in? Were they not all buried in Black Level?
But I think we could fix it all better. Mary goes up there regularly.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned the crematorium thing. What do you call them? Well, I mentioned that one. Now, just to mention something modern, in case you wonder what they are for people that are cremated. There's some name on it, the Columba Wall or something. Was that right, Bernie? But this is something very new. So just in case you wonder what it is. So if you can't get a plot in the cemetery, you might be able to get a place for your ashes. Okay.
Columbarian Wall.
The Columbarian Wall. That's what it's called. Okay. Yes. Yeah. So.
Columbarian Wall was meant to be up in the graveyard.
I know. No. I knew that. Yeah. You know. So now. So we go over here. There's one over here that's in the 1916 Rising. On the headstone that he was in the Fingal Brigade, Old IRA, and he's a man called Jack Howard. He's one of the Howards from down the town. There were quite a lot of them. I'm sure anyone that's local will know who I'm talking about. But he always went by the Bunyan Howard. So I don't know why, but he died in 1973, and his wife his wife was a Mongie, the real old swords, you know. So that is Jack Howard's. Very few of them have it written on them. That's why I'm sorry, we seemed a bit vague, but we went and I'm kind of looking up to see where they are. But we'll get it in order maybe by next Easter, you know. But I've tracked down about at least 20 who are in it that are buried here, you know. Okay. Now. So. Coleman grave, and his nephew, which was Richard O'Coleman as well, he got this put there before he died. He died about 2 years ago, and it's just a lot of people thought that the man that was in the Rising was buried in Swords, but he's not. He's in the Republican plot in Glasnevin. But the Colemans go back a long time, and that's the family grave. So that's another one. Now this one is to Ryan, and anyone know from Ger Ryan that lives down in North Street opposite the Carnegie Library. His mother was a Coleman, and they were also some way connected to a family called Walsh, who lived beside the Borough School in a thatched house, and they were called Walsh's the Pump Borers, and it was taken over by Paddy DeLargy, who built the new house there. It was a new house then beside the Borough School. But I was given a photograph of the old thatched house. I think it might have been the last thatched house in Swords, because one of the DeLargy girls, and we had this competition about what Swords means to me that we do, and she entered it last year, and she did all this thing out about the family. So she had this picture of the thatched house, which was interesting, and how her father bought it over and knocked it down and built it. You know, that house is still up there beside the Borough School. But I'll tell you a funny story, and this is something you mightn't believe. People maybe from around here might, but if you come in, my granny was from Swords. She was a Cleary. The family goes back generations, and she was married to a man called Nicholas Lowndes. and he died. So she got some job down in Skerries, as you do, because there was no widow's pension around that time. And she met my grandfather, who was a widower, and he was from Wicklow. And they lived in Skerries till 1915, and they moved back up to Swords. And my mother used to tell the story. I don't know whether Mrs. Hamill was there at the time. She mightn't have been. But anyway, Granny brought her down to start school in Swords. And she was 9. And she said the teacher asked her to read. And she stood up and she was reading lovely out of this book, grand, not a bother on her. And she suddenly looked around and all the other young ones were nudging one another and making a laugh of her. So why do you think they were making a laugh of her? She had a Skerries accent. So they're the kind of things that, you know, but they all the families, and like somebody said to me about everyone being related to savages. Like there's that Paddy Savage that comes over from Chicago, like he comes down to us, and like he volumes of stuff on the savages. But a few generations back there was a family of 17 of them. I see they're all married into everyone around the town, you know, everyone seems to be related to savages. But that's what happened in places like this, I think, when people didn't move around so much, you know. So I don't know, I'll tell you about some of you who weren't here last year. I'll tell you another interesting story about somebody else, if you care to walk another little bit with me. Okay, we go out this way maybe, Bernie, yeah. Angers or Ungers probably of they had the coach, they owned Roganstown House at one time, and also what was it called, the Noxadan Inn up on I think it's still there. Is it still there, Tim Gleeson? You do be up that way. The Noxadan Inn, the big old house up on the top road.
Where the what's his name, restaurants?
No, that's Brackenstown. Yeah, no.
It's a big house.
Yeah, it is. It was the direct coach road from Dublin to Drogheda, and it was where they used to change the horses there. The Noxadan Inn. Yeah, but those Angers owned it.
Last time I noticed it.
Somebody told me that they thought it was knocked down or something. I don't know. I'm never up that way. You know.
Still there.
So is it? Yeah. Well, that's who they are. You know. So they're probably the same as these Angers that were Anger Street in town. Like they must have been well off to have all this lovely surround or whatever. Maybe they were afraid of body snatchers or something. Maybe that's why. Well, that used to happen, you see. So we walk another little bit. Well, if you look at it, it's the grave of a James Cleary. And then you have Patrick Cleary of Mountgorry. Now, Patrick Cleary was the first cousin of my granny's. And you're going to say, so what? Like, well, what's so important about him? And my mother is buried here, but that's another story, because she didn't want to be buried with the Marks. Anyway, but Patrick Cleary was, as I said, a first cousin of my granny, and he was reared on Main Street. The house was where I think was knocked down. It's now that town centre mall opposite the Hawthorne there. And Paddy got a job as a ploughman in Early's farm, which was up in Mountgorry, where we used to live. And he went up there every day and did his job. And one day he was coming home and he was bitten by a mad dog that had rabies. And in those days that meant certain death. So the doctor at the time was a Dr. Davies, and he cauterised the wound. And there were a few more that had happened to as well, including a young child of 3, which was a proctor, the one you were talking about, Mary, and a few more. So in the meantime, this Dr. Davies, who was very well thought of in the area, he lived in a house called Cremona, which is up on the Forest Road. He died suddenly. And I have the minute book of the dispensary, and they got in this new young doctor as a locum, and he seemed to know what was going on in the outside world. So he brought this thing up to the Balrotherry Board of Guardians that they should send these patients to Paris to the Pasteur Clinic to be cured. So my mother used to have all these cuttings at home about Paddy in the paper, and I looked it up and I found that Louis Pasteur made his findings known to the public in 1890, and this happened in 1894. So these 5 guys, there's a lot of to and fro and having meetings. So actually they made up their mind that they would pay to send these 5 patients to Paris, and Mrs. Proctor went with them to be in charge because her child was only 3. Now Proctors lived on the Malahide Road in a house called Milton. There was Milton House, which was knocked down to build the pavilions, and then there was another house there as well. In our time, people called Clearys lived in it, which were nothing to me. But the Proctors lived there, and old Proctor, I think, was ex-RIC man. He was retired, and in turn, then you go on, and they were some way related to Duffs, and that's another story. But the meeting of and Mary, you researched that years ago about Paddy Cleary, do you remember? But they got 30. Mrs. Proctor got £30 to bring them all to Paris and to stay in a guest house for 3 weeks and go to the Pasteur clinic every day. And they came home, and Paddy lived to be, because I remember him, I was 10 when Paddy lived to be 88, and he was ploughing. The farm was Dickie's after that then, and he was married to somebody that was Early's nanny or something. He had some connection with them, and Early's hotel was down on the main street. And that's another thing of interesting. One of those early women, the Earlys kind of gave up farming, and 2 of them were solicitors, and one of the daughters, Helena Early, she became a solicitor, and she's recorded as being the first woman solicitor in Ireland, and she came from Swords. So there's another bit of interest for you. But this was my relation, Paddy, and his claim to fame was that he was in Paris when people didn't even go into Dublin. So that's about it. So I don't know if I've any more now to tell you. So if you're happy with that, okay. Bernie wants to go out and record the hooks on the wall for tying up the ponies and trap to end up the video. So is that okay? Yeah. Are you happy with that?
What was Paddy suffering from?
He got a bit. I researched that, and somebody gave me some stuff, and it seemed his wife was the sister of Major Reynolds. Did I ever see that film Zulu? Yeah. Well, the Major Reynolds that was in, well, he was the doctor in that film Zulu. He was a brother-in-law of this Dr. Davies that was Years and Swords. Like, go on and on and on, you know, from one thing to the other. It's like a black hole. There's always something to research, you know. So that's about it, okay? Reynolds, who, just to show you how small a world it is, a Dr. Reynolds who had given them photographs or something, who was this man's grandnephew. So I got in touch with him, and we went out to see him. I'm sure he was quite old at the time, and he gave us access to a lot of your man's will and stuff like that, and it's very interesting, you know. This Dr. Davies seemed to be very keen on everything being just so when he died, and he'd all things about where his coffin should be, and they should give money to the children for cakes and a lot of stuff like that, you know. But, you know, kind of. But the other thing then about this man I went out to, now this is taken about, when I say it's a small world, the minute I went out to this man 10 years ago, he asked me, did I know Dr. Greenan? It seems he'd been in college with Dr. Greenan, and you know, you could go on and on. So, and as a matter of fact, Mrs. Greenan is 95 now, so I've interviewed and I have a little bit about her in the next Swords Voice. I know she's not Old Swords, but she's delighted with herself that we've made that much of her to put her in it, because she's not Old Swords, and I would say she's a great lady, you know, and the head is still going great. She talks away, you know. So that, like, you can go on and on, you know, that. So that's it. So as I said, Bernie wants to do the hooks on the wall for tying up your pony and trap. So that's how he's going to end the video. It's on. Now we're just ending our tour of the graveyard outside on the wall, just to show you the relics of old decency, as the people say. There are hooks all along the wall that have been here for generations, for people used to tie up their pony and trap when they were going to mass. So they're here, and we keep watching them, like, so that nobody will take them away or anything. There are there's 1, 2, 3, many, 4, 5. There are 5 of them, you know. And at one stage, I think people used to tie their bicycles to them, but they were meant to be for pony and traps, you know. So that's it. So I hope you all enjoyed the walk around the graveyard, and you might know a little bit that you didn't know before. Thank you very much.
Thank you.